Right now, there are 2.5 million electric cars on the road in America, but in just 7 years, in other words, by 2030, experts believe that between a third or even half of all light vehicles sold here in the United States will be electric vehicles. Combustion engine cars are a dying breed, and soon sales of combustion engine cars will be banned. That's a sad but simple fact. So here's the big question. What'll happen to the U.S. power grid when all Americans go EV? Will the power grid get overloaded and fried, causing power outages and so forth? Today I'll clarify what's myth versus fact. Before I get talking about the near future, let's talk about the here and now. Believe it or not, some electrical grid operators in the United States are already struggling to keep up with demand in certain areas and at certain times. Take California, for instance. Last September, California power authorities asked residents to avoid charging their electric vehicles in the evening during the heat wave so that the power grid wouldn't be overloaded by people running air conditioners. That's where they stand right now. So imagine how worse things will get as Americans buy more EVs. Speaking of California, did you know that Palo Alto has the highest EV adoption rate than any other city in the United States? Get this, Palo Alto has 25,000 households. Of those, 1 out of every 6 households own at least one EV as we speak. That's some 4,500 EVs out of the 52,000 vehicles registered in the city. Plus, on top of that, during the work week, commuters from the surrounding area drive another 3,000 to 5,000 EVs into the city. Now, this city has a lot of charging ports. I'm talking about 1,000 charging ports spread across 277 public charging stations. And there's another 3,500 charging ports at residences. One of the reasons Palo Alto has the most EVs is due to the local government's aggressive sustainability and climate action plan. Its goal is to reduce the city's greenhouse gas emissions to 80% below the 1990 level, and that's all by 2030. Compare that to the entire state of California. The state goal is to achieve the same amount by 2050. In other words, the state has 20 additional years to achieve the goal. So you can see why Palo Alto has an aggressive plan. Anyway, to meet the 2030 emissions reduction goals, Palo Alto will most likely increase the amount of local renewable energy that's being used for electricity generation. Palo Alto has already given its residents incentives to purchase EVs and charging ports, but the city still has a long way to go to reach its goals in less than 7 years. But let's look at the U.S. as a whole. Utility companies in other states have also warned of rolling blackout periods to prevent total system collapse. Well, I'll tell you now, there's good news and bad news. Let's start with the good. There are many experts who think that utility industry will be ready to generate enough power for the coming EV wave. That's because of capacity increases that are already in the works. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in investment. But the bad news is there's a serious threat to bottlenecks in the local grids that transmit electricity to the individual homes and businesses. To generate the extra electricity needed to charge more and more EVs, neighborhood power distribution systems need expensive upgrades. Plus, as more electric trucks and delivery vans hit the roads, more money will be needed to upgrade the wires and transformers that serve these commercial sites. And analysts believe that these expensive investments will just end up pushing up the price of electricity, which is only common sense. In other words, at the end of the day, we the consumer will ultimately end up eating the cost of ramping up the power grid. Because of these forecasts, there's much debate on what's the best solution to deal with higher demand for electricity. There's one line of thinking that says companies can manage the demand by controlling when EVs are charged. For example, encourage less charging when electricity is at peak hours by varying the cost of electricity or offering incentives. Anyway, to understand what needs to be done and prepared, you have to understand the 3 major components of the electrical system. I'm talking mainly about power generation, long-distance electric transmission, and finally, local distribution. Let's start with power generation. Here in the U.S., we have some 12,000 utility-scale power plants. I'm talking about power plants that generate the electricity by burning natural gas, coal, oil, or splitting atoms, or harnessing energy from green sources like the sun, wind, or water. The good news is, right now, EV charging consumes just a small part of all our power production in the States. And when I say small, I mean very small. A recent study found that in 2021, the 2.1 million EVs across the U.S. consumed less than 0.2% of the total watt hours of power consumed that year. So one question could be, how much of electricity will EVs consume when all Americans go EV? Well, the answer depends on who you ask. According to the Electric Power Research Institute, from 2021 to 2030, all types of EVs, including commercial trucks and buses, will increase America's overall electricity consumption somewhere between 8% to 13%. But here's the thing, EV charging isn't the only thing that's going to affect future power generation. Analysts expect power demand will increase in general. For example, some local governments are already deterring and will eventually disallow the installation of gas stoves and gas furnaces. Instead, they want residents to use electric stoves and furnaces. It's not like power companies have never dealt with big increases in electricity demand before. They have, if you're old enough to remember. Think back to the era when air conditioning was becoming more mainstream. That was 50 years ago. More AC installations meant more electricity consumption. Or if you want to look at a more recent example, just think of how popular cloud storage is nowadays and how it's possible because of the construction of massive data centers. Now, while power companies have dealt with big increases in electricity demand before, the problem is it's hard to predict the speed of EV adoption. There are just too many variables involved. I'm talking things like gas prices, buildup of public charging stations, the price and availability of EVs, the continuation of government incentives, and so forth. Consider, too, the power companies know years in advance about the arrival of new housing developments, shopping centers, and factories that will soon demand more electricity. So there, they have time to prepare and upgrade their facilities. But it's a lot less predictable with electric vehicles. Right now, there's a lot of pressure to ramp up power production for EV charging. I'm talking about regulations, environmental groups, and even investors who want electric companies to stay away from coal and gas-fired plants completely. But look, if you shut down those plants, you still need to replace their electricity output with something else. Anyway, despite all that, experts still believe the industry will be able to keep up. By 2030, utility companies expect to spend between $1.5 trillion to $1.8 trillion overall on infrastructure and operations. From that, some 22% to 30% of the cost will be adding electrical storage capacity. If you look at the historical trend of U.S. electric generation, apparently, they say the U.S. will be able to progressively support a growing EV fleet as EV adoption continues. In fact, most power grids are already generating extra capacity during certain periods of the day. The U.S. currently has enough capability to charge 80 million EVs during the overnight hours. That exceeds the projection of 26 million EVs on the road by 2030. Now, you must understand that as soon as electricity leaves its generating site, its voltage gets stepped up. Reason why it's so high is so it can zoom through the long-distance high-power transmission lines. I'm talking about those tall towers you see across the country. They say that by 2030, we're going to need a 10% expansion in high-voltage transmission capacity. Basically, they'll need to connect new solar and wind-powered installation on the grid to supply power for EVs. All these needed upgrades will cost anywhere from $30 billion to $40 billion. But it's not all bad news. This is where the government money can help. The recent Inflation Reduction Act alone offers almost $3 billion for transmission networks, and the 2021 Infrastructure Act offers up a whopping $10.5 billion to upgrade the power grid overall. But even with government money, there's a host of other challenges. There's the whole issue of trying to obtain the rights of way in government permits. And don't forget the challenge of sourcing all required materials. As it is right now, we're already seeing supply chain backlogs for larger poles, transmission lines, and other important components. It's a huge mess as it is. Then we have the third and last main piece of the electrical system. I'm talking about local power distribution, which will largely impact when America fully electrifies. Here's why. At the local level, electricity voltage has to be reduced so it can be safely sent through the local grid. Once it's sent through the local grid, wires take all that electricity into the neighborhoods, stores, and offices. From there, transformers reduce the voltage even more to either 120 or 240 volts. But here's where the problems start. Charging an EV could mean a major boost to the electricity transmitting capacity of the wires and transformers in a residential household not set up for that much power. I'm talking a 70% to 130% increase depending on the power of the charger. That's huge. And it won't be cheap. Through 2030, utility companies need to invest anywhere between $1,700 and $5,800 in power grid improvements for each light-duty electric vehicle sold. And when it comes to the general power industry, nationwide costs for this work could surpass $10 billion through 2030. So while utility companies will expect to gain a lot of revenue from EV households, it may not be enough to cover the needed upgrades. So to fix this problem, utility companies may likely need to increase the cost of electricity up to 12%. Here's yet another problem, and that's charging commercial EVs at industrial parks, warehouses, and package depots. Reason is, these types of heavy-duty commercial EVs typically need a lot more electricity than the average passenger EV. Then there's the unpredictable wild card of figuring out how local grids will distribute power to supply public charging stations. All this extra pressure on the local distribution grid could mean serious backlogs in equipment and shortages of workers to install them. I'm talking months or even years to install new infrastructure and get it running. That's why some utility companies are already working with car makers and technology providers on smart charging. California here again is an example. So there's a pilot project involving Sacramento Municipal Utility District plus GM, Ford, and BMW. The project solicits input from EV owners on the best time to charge their EVs based on their commutes and overall schedules. Then the smart charging technology coordinates that time with the off-peak power periods to figure out their optimum charging time. To sign up, customers receive $150 and then they receive quarterly payments of $20. Now there's Michigan. Over in Michigan, DTE Energy is currently testing out a program with GM, Ford, and BMW, which allows the power company to pause EV charging during periods of peak electricity demand. Before a pause, customers can be taxed. Participating customers also receive up to $100 in gift cards. No other utilities like Duke Energy and Pacific Gas and Electric Company are experimenting with advanced systems rather than relying on traditional ones. For example, there's testing a smart charging setup called bidirectional charging. With bidirectional charging, you can let your EV aid the power during peak demand. Basically, your EV sends power from its own battery pack to your house. So imagine you have most EVs participating in that together. They contribute to a solution. Then in off-peak hours, the utility company refills your EV battery. Smart as that sounds when it comes to setting this up, of course. This requires upgrading power networks as well as the wiring inside residential homes, plus specific charging technology inside the EVs. But now you tell me. They say the U.S. has 290 million cars on the road right now. If that kind of volume were to electrify hypothetically by 2030, do you think our power grid will be able to handle it? Or will it get fried? Please share by commenting below. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for your support.